Approximately 50% of advocates' work is focused on people with serious mental illness, known as SMIs. My son, David, lives with schizoaffective disorder, one of the most difficult SMIs to treat, and was a client of advocates for many years. He's unable to live on his own, unable to work, struggles with personal hygiene, and like so many others, tries so hard every day to live a normal life. The sad truth, however, is that SMIs are brain dysfunctions. Parts of their brains are permanently damaged. Many will never be able to live a normal life. There are effective treatments, but there are no cures. Schizoaffective disorder is what is called a psychotic illness, which is characterized by visual hallucinations, auditory hallucinations, or hearing voices, and false fixed beliefs known as delusions. Every client under advocate's care is assigned a mobile clinician, a person with appropriate academic credentials to work with people with psychiatric illnesses in their homes, on the street, in coffee shops, wherever necessary. These mobile clinicians are in the trenches with those with SMIs and are the very embodiment of the advocate's way. I have known and worked with mobile clinicians at advocates. This is a story of one of them named Eric. Advocates received a phone call one day that my David was standing in the middle of a busy street, yelling obscenities at people and throwing rocks at cars. David was in psychosis at the time and unaware of what he was doing. The police had been called, but Eric was the first person there to help. Calmly and with respect for David's dignity, Eric was able to stop the cars and convince David to go to the sidewalk with him. Once out of danger, Eric was able to get David back to some cognizant awareness that he had been in danger and was endangering others. A year or more later, Eric was able to get David, a year or more later, after leaving advocates due to a life-threatening illness triggered by COVID, Eric called me and said, "Do you remember me?" I said, "Of course I did," and asked how he was doing. All he said was, "I'm dying." He called because he wanted to say goodbye to David, but of course could not, as it would disturb or confuse David in a potentially harmful way. But Eric also wanted to talk to me. He wanted me to know how important David was to him. He wanted me to know that he knew who David really was, the person David would have been without the illness. He said David was the most beautiful person he had ever met, that he was gracious to others, caring, kind, who wanted to help whoever and however he could, and who had a wonderful heart. He said, "I want you to know that I am a better person, a better man for having known David, and I am so grateful to him for that." I realized that I was talking to perhaps the only person in the world who knew David the way I knew him, the person he was before he was stricken with mental illness. Eric, a man in his 40s, was crying and then quickly said what I assumed would be his last goodbye to me and David. That's the kind of person advocates hires. I know many of them, and that's why advocates deserves our support. People with serious mental illness and so many others deserve people like Eric to care for them. Please give generously to advocates so they can continue to touch people's lives the way Eric touched ours. Thank you.
If you're here with us in the sanctuary, please put any loose cash or checks made out to advocates into the plates as the ushers come around. If you are with us online today, you can go to the website advocates.org and there click on the orange Donate Now button. You can either donate directly online or at that same link, you'll see the address where you can send in your check. This morning's offering will now be given and received in grateful appreciation. Please join with me of the words of our community response. We are grateful for the opportunity to give and serve, and grateful for the gifts we have received. May this affirm the ministries of our church community, both within and beyond these walls. Each year, I have a question box or Ask the Minister Sunday. And over the years, I have often been asked to share my elevator speech about Unitarian Universalism. And I completely understand why people ask me to do this. Sometimes it feels like with our 7 Unitarian Universalist principles, and maybe even more daunting, our 6 Unitarian Universalist sources, it's hard to summarize briefly what we're all about. It's easy enough to get parts of it. It's relatively straightforward that we come from the far liberal end of the Protestant Reformation. It's easy enough to get our rich history of social justice and reform work. And you can kind of see how all of these things eventually got us to where we are now and what we are now. But how to summarize it quickly for someone new to Unitarian Universalism in the length of an elevator ride? It's pretty hard. And yet, if you love this church and if you love Unitarian Universalism, it's really nice to be able to do it, to be able to tell your friends, or at least when they ask. Sometimes Unitarian Universalists feel like even though we love our church, spiritually speaking, sometimes we might feel like there's not much there. You know, spiritual things are happening, but it's so hard to describe it or put it into words. And it comes from so many different sources, so many other religions and traditions, that sometimes it feels like we're borrowing from here, there, and everywhere. And yes, we have this incredible social justice tradition and history, but sometimes it feels almost like that relatively coherent social justice effort that goes through the ages is making up for the lack of religious coherence. And it's not like we don't all love the mess of it all. It's weird and it's wonderful and it's rich and there's depth. But wait, what is Unitarian Universalism again? This summer, while I was doing some of my summer reading, I came to appreciate something much more clearly than I ever had before. Namely, we do have a very coherent spiritual heritage as Unitarian Universalists that isn't necessarily so hard to describe. I believe that in most ways, Unitarian Universalism in the 21st century is mostly an updated version of Transcendentalism. We are 21st century Transcendentalists. Boom, elevator speech over. It seems so obvious. Maybe we're just too close to it to see it. Some of you are very familiar with Transcendentalism, and I'm sure that some of you are not familiar with it much at all. Some people learn about it in high school or maybe college. I first learned about it in high school English class, even though I grew up a Unitarian Universalist. I learned about Ralph Waldo Emerson and Henry David Thoreau and others really for the first time in English class. So then I could go back to church and appreciate the pictures of those old guys hanging on the wall somewhere in the church. And in my teen brain, I could now identify the guy with the funny-looking Amish beard as Henry David Thoreau, and the guy with the Ringo Starr nose, that was Ralph Waldo Emerson. So that's who those old guys were. Good to know. So strange to grow up Unitarian Universalist and yet really learn about these important figures first in my public high school. Maybe we Unitarian Universalists are really burying the lead. I plan to do a few sermons on Transcendentalism this church year, and it will be a sermon series, if you will. And today I just want to bring out a few of the basic points for your consideration and hopefully appreciation. Transcendentalism was a movement in the mid-19th century New England, especially in and around Concord, not so far from us here in Littleton at all. In fact, some of you even drove here from Concord this morning. Though most Unitarian Universalists in Concord go to the huge Unitarian Universalist church in that town, First Parish, the very same church that Emerson and Thoreau and so many other Transcendentalists belonged to. Even in my high school English class, it was clear that there was a religious movement here, not just a literary movement. The peak of Transcendentalism was really from about 1835 to about 1855. And of course, there's far more to say than I could say in a sermon or even a series of sermons. Emerson was really the central figure, and much of the movement was, at least in the beginning, a reaction against the Unitarianism of that day, as well as certain social trends like materialism, industrialism, and conformity. The majority of Transcendentalists were Unitarians. Many of them were, in fact, ordained Unitarian ministers. Thoreau was a Unitarian layperson who left the church, though most Transcendentalists remained in the Unitarian church. Emerson was a Unitarian minister from a long line of Unitarian ministers. He left parish ministry, but he continued to go to the Unitarian church there in Concord, though it continued to make him cringe regularly. He did continue to offer pulpit supply at Unitarian churches. Some of the Transcendentalists, like Theodore Parker, remained in parish ministry, though Parker did get blacklisted from preaching in Boston Unitarian churches for years because of his radical ideas. Some of the Transcendentalists, like Margaret Fuller and Elizabeth Peabody, were remarkable Unitarian scholars and writers and reformers, but without, of course, the same privileges and opportunities as their male comrades. The Transcendentalists were the even further fringe of the Protestant Reformation. Yes, the Unitarians, by the 19th century, they had left the Trinity behind, they had left Calvinism behind, they had left other creeds behind, making a much more liberal and open style of Christianity. But to Transcendentalists, this 19th century Unitarianism was still, to quote Emerson, corpse cold. It didn't speak to what was happening in the here and now. It was continuing to put all its faith, literally, in the Bible, even if the interpretations the Unitarians were making were fairly progressive. It continued to put all of its eggs in the Jesus basket. And even though that Jesus basket, properly interpreted, is a pretty nice basket to be in, the Transcendentalists wanted more. Unitarianism of that day often thought that the miracles of Jesus offered crucial proof of the validity of Christianity. But the Transcendentalists weren't very interested in Jesus' miracles at all. They were much more interested in the miracles of the natural world all around them. The Transcendentalists were early readers of Eastern religious scriptures when they became available in English translation especially. In Transcendentalist writings from the 19th century, you see references to the Bhagavad Gita, the Upanishads. You see references to the teachings of the Buddha and Sufi writings. And yes, they still revered the prophets of the Hebrew scriptures, and of course, they still revered Jesus. But there were so many other sources for spiritual truth and knowing, including especially what you could intuit at first hand through your own experiences, particularly in nature. As for social justice, yes, Unitarianism had this pretty good tradition of being on the right side of history. But the Transcendentalists were even more outspoken, and they were very outspoken at this time on, for instance, very importantly, the abolition of slavery, some of them involved in the Underground Railroad, and they pushed that envelope even further on social justice issues, as Thoreau famously did when he was arrested for refusing to pay poll tax in protest both of slavery and of the Mexican-American War. And later he wrote Civil Disobedience, so prescient and brilliant that it influenced even Mahatma Gandhi and Martin Luther King Jr. That's a sermon for another day. In fact, I believe that the Transcendentalists were so far ahead of their time that going on 200 years later, you don't really have to extrapolate too far to see Unitarian Universalism as it is today in 2022. Some of you will wonder where the name, the word transcendentalist, came from. In essence, theirs was a philosophy and a religion that transcended cognitive understanding or even scriptures. It transcended the need for historical learning. They still believe that those things, cognitive understanding, historical learning, and scripture, was important, had great value, but what was most important to them transcended anything you could learn from outside of yourself, except perhaps what you learn from nature itself. Central to their belief was what Emerson called self-reliance. It's often been misinterpreted to mean being self-sufficient, as a rugged individualist without needing any help from anyone, but what Emerson really meant was rely on your own experience, rely on your own intuition. Emerson and other transcendentalists thought that each person has the ability to intuit spiritual and religious truths all on their own. That was, in the mid-19th century, a pretty radical idea. Maybe it still is. And to me, this transcendental spirit is very much alive in the first of our 6 sources of our living, which is a very transcendentalist concept, our living tradition. That first source being direct experience of that transcending mystery and wonder, affirmed in all cultures, which moves us to a renewal of the spirit and an openness to the forces which create and uphold life. The Transcendentalists also had great faith in human nature and human capacity, which is very much with us in our living tradition. In the first of our 7 principles, believing in affirming the inherent worth and dignity of every person. The practical focus of the Transcendentalists was on something they called self-culture. It was their central goal. Today, we'd probably call it spiritual growth through spiritual practices. What fascinates me is that most of the spiritual practices they suggested were things that many 21st century Unitarian Universalists are still doing. Perhaps without even knowing it, you've been actively engaged in many, maybe even most, transcendental spiritual practices. As retired Unitarian Universalist minister Barry Andrews puts it, Unitarian Universalists today are generally under the impression that our tradition has little to offer to those who wish to engage in any sort of spiritual discipline. Thus, they look to Buddhism, transcendental meditation, Jewish and Christian mysticism, etc., for guidance, largely unaware of the fact that our own religious movement, through Transcendentalism, developed a uniquely, authentically Unitarian Universalist form of spiritual practice. Namely, self-culture, or the spiritual disciplines of the Transcendentalists, were things like spending time in nature, walking in nature if you're able, spending time in contemplation and reflection, spending time in meaningful conversation, living simply, reading, journaling, and other writing, and very importantly, making use of the spiritual insights you gain in the world through working for a better, more just society. I don't know about you, but I can get behind all of that. In my next sermon on Transcendentalism, I want to talk about Emerson's Oversoul and other Transcendentalist theologies, including versions of theism, which look more like pantheism and panentheism, and even religious humanism, things which are very much with us in the 21st century Unitarian Universalist movement. It's a rich tradition indeed, and I'm really excited to focus a little more on it this year. And I wonder, how is it that we haven't been more focused on Transcendentalism all along? Why is it that in some ways it appears, if you read history books, that Transcendentalism disappeared after the Civil War? To a large extent, I think it's because the Transcendentalists won. They won the battle for Unitarianism and eventually Unitarian Universalism, but in slow motion, so that it wasn't dramatic enough for people to notice it happening. Eventually, their radical ideas and broad search for truth and spiritual growth, beyond a focus on Jesus and liberal Christianity, became the heart of Unitarian Universalism. Transcendentalism is hiding in plain sight right here at First Church Unitarianism and across the congregations of our association. It's probably also the case that Transcendentalism is hiding in plain sight among many liberal, non-religiously affiliated seekers out there. Some of you have been telling your like-minded, non-religiously affiliated friends for years that they are Unitarian Universalists and just don't know it. Maybe. Today, I'm telling you that we and your friends have been modern-day Transcendentalists all along and maybe didn't know it. May we embrace the richness of this tradition, our own tradition, and its spirit of searching for the truth and spiritual growth wherever it may be found, within and beyond these walls. May we embrace the richness of this tradition that ever insists that spiritual growth must always lead to working for justice and a more equitable world. May we indeed be very worthy 21st century Transcendentalists. Blessed be, and amen. Our closing hymn, the screens aren't going to help us today, but luckily the lyrics are on the back of your bulletin. Our closing hymn is by a modern Unitarian Universalist, Peter Mayer, and I think you might agree that he's also a Transcendentalist. I invite you to rise in spirit for our closing hymn, Holy Now. For our closing words, I invite you, if you're comfortable holding hands, you may do so, but please, let's be excellent to each other and respect everyone's wishes. If you're not comfortable holding hands, you can either hold them up, or if you're comfortable touching elbows. We'll be figuring this out from week to week in our new normal endemic. All right. To thine own self be true. It's okay if 1 week Christianity speaks to you, and 1 week Buddhism does, and next week paganism does. It's okay, because a foolish consistency is the hobgoblin of little minds. And your minds are vast. Trust your intuition to teach you the insight you need to lead a more spiritual and better life. And let that light shine. May it be so. Go in peace.